Hi, welcome to the screencast for D6 and D7 on antibacterials and antivirals. Antibacterials we know more commonly as antibiotics, and you probably remember back from some of your biology or life science that penicillin was an accidental discovery by a fellow named Fleming. He had some contamination in his bacterial cultures. Some mold had gotten in there, and he realized it stopped the bacteria from growing around that area. So it revolutionized modern medicine when all of a sudden we came up with something that could fight these bacteria, which often could cause some very nasty illnesses. So antibiotics are chemicals usually produced by other microorganisms that fight against the microorganism of bacteria. And so in the 1930s, Florey and Chain began working with penicillin, and they injected it into live mice and saw it could cure bacterial infections, and that worked in humans. And it was such a wonder drug that they didn't really understand how it was working chemically, but they went ahead and produced and used it because there was such a need for it. So in 1945, so several years later, finally, a woman named Dorothy Hodgkin determined the structure of what's known as penicillin G, and that's the original penicillin that Fleming had found in his studies. And what they found is that penicillin works by preventing crosslinks in a bacteria's cell walls, so it's going to weaken the walls, and the bacteria is going to rupture and die during the reproductive stage when it needs to have that extra strength there. And that's something important to understand, how penicillin works by disrupting the cell walls so it ruptures when it's trying to reproduce. It's effective for a wide range of bacteria, infections of the ears, nose, and throat, mouth, wounds, food poisoning, you name it. The big disadvantage is that a true penicillin, as opposed to other antibiotics, is broken down by stomach acid, so it has to be injected directly into the blood. And if you've never had a penicillin shot, hope you never have to have one, because it's a big molecule, so it's a big needle, and those suckers hurt. So instead what they have done is they've modified the side chain on penicillin G and come up with these other antibiotics which have similar names, like amoxicillin, and there's a whole bunch of them out there. Z-Pax is another one that people tend to have prescribed often. But there's all these other antibiotics that we can take orally because they're not affected by the stomach acid. One of the issues we've come up with, though, is that because antibiotics became plentiful and fairly inexpensive, some bacteria are going to be resistant to the penicillin. And it's because penicillin produces an enzyme called penicillinase, which can open the four-membered ring structure. There's a 3-carbon and a nitrogen, and that leaves the penicillin ineffective. And when more and more of those bacteria resist the antibiotic and reproduce, you come up with these super bugs that are resistant to any antibiotics we have, and it's become a fairly big problem in the last 20 years. Main causes of it, pretty easy to come up with. Antibiotics are overprescribed. Patients don't finish their course of medication when they feel better, so then some of the really nasty bugs survive. And the use of antibiotics in animal feeds, especially cattle and chickens, end up entering our food chain. So solutions or responses to this that would help the problem would be develop different forms of penicillin, control and restrict the use of antibiotics while encouraging doctors not to overprescribe, and educate patients on the importance of completing the treatment even if they feel better. Some of the most drug-resistant bacteria worldwide are strains of tuberculosis. They figure 1 in 7 tuberculosis bacteria is going to be resistant to bacteria. And tuberculosis isn't a problem in this country right now, but it is prevalent in developing countries and prisons, other crowded areas. And they figure it's just a matter of time that it ends up in developed countries like the United States. And it's going to be a problem then with all the bacteria-resistant strains out there. Antivirals then, D7, are just what they sound like. They help treat viruses. Viruses are quite a bit different than bacteria. They're small, simple structures as opposed to bacteria, which are fairly large and fairly complex, at least from that size of organisms. Viruses must reproduce inside a host cell, whereas bacteria reproduce on their own. And so it's debated whether or not viruses are really a living organism or not. They take over a host cell, and they use the host cell to assemble new viral particles. They cause diseases like measles, polio, meningitis, avian flu, AIDS, SARS, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome, which we fortunately haven't heard much about lately, and then of course the common cold. So big differences between viruses and bacteria. Viruses are very small. They may or may not have an outer layer. They have a protein core as well as a core of genetic material, but they can't reproduce on their own. They have to invade a host cell and inject their genes into it. Whereas bacteria, relatively speaking, are large. They have that rigid cell wall. They contain all the genetic information they need of itself. So they have DNA and ribosomes, and they can produce on their own, and they're definitely a living organism. So how do we treat viral infections? Well, it's complex for a number of reasons. First of all, the viruses live within other cells, so they can't be easily targeted because you're not sure who the host cells are, and also you don't necessarily want to destroy the host cells. They also multiply quickly, so it's often spread throughout the body or even spread to other people by the time any symptoms appear, which is why things like cold and flu are so contagious. The viruses also mutate rapidly. So drugs no longer work within a very short time. So if I have the flu and then you catch it from me, something that worked against my flu may not work against your flu because by then it's mutated. So that's why the flu shot is new and different every year, and it's just always their best guess of what will happen. One thing that's been effective with viruses is the idea of a vaccine, and the vaccine allows the body to prepare antibodies against a virus. And so successful vaccines have been developed for many deadly viral diseases like cholera, polio, and measles, but there's still no vaccine for something as common as the cold. And we've also seen a recent trend in the last 20 years of people choosing not to vaccinate their children against measles and polio because they feel there's a connection with autism, which there's a huge debate whether that connection exists or not. But as a result, we're starting to see diseases which we haven't seen in this country for a long time, such as measles, and smallpox is another one that was eradicated through the use of a vaccine. So antivirals, how do they work? Well, they work by altering the host cell's genetic material, or DNA, so the virus can't use it to reproduce. They block the enzyme activity in the host cell so the virus can't reproduce. Or they block the virus from leaving the cell. So it goes ahead and reproduces, but now it just can't get out. The only one that actually blocks the virus from entering the host cell is the fourth one, where they change the cell membrane to keep the virus from ever entering. So the first three stop symptoms, but it doesn't actually eradicate or kill the virus. It just prevents it from reproducing. So that virus could still remain in your body for years, like the viruses that cause herpes and chickenpox, and then later come out. Chickenpox, you maybe have known somebody who's developed shingles later on in life. But only the fourth method, as I mentioned, is prophylactic and actually prevents the virus from gaining entrance to your body. AIDS is a viral pandemic that was first diagnosed in 1981. It's caused by the HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus. It's estimated that over 40 million people worldwide are infected with HIV. Up to a third of all adults in some African countries are estimated to be carrying HIV. Now, not all of these will develop into full-blown AIDS, but certainly a number of them will, and especially for people who live under stress and poverty, poor nutrition, etc. So what is AIDS? It's a failure of the immune system. So the body falls prey to any infectious disease, so something like pneumonia can be fatal, and certainly makes it more prone to things such as cancer. It primarily infects vital white blood cells called T cells, which normally help the immune system. And it's a retrovirus, and a retrovirus contains RNA instead of DNA. So when the virus invades a host cell, the host cell has to reverse transcribe the RNA to DNA. And when that host cell reproduces, the HIV DNA is integrated into the host cell and then replicated over and over along with the host cell's DNA. So it basically just inserts itself right into that host cell and mutates it into a new HIV type cell. Currently, HIV is best treated and controlled through the use of antiretroviral drugs. AZT is maybe one you've heard of. They act at different stages of the HIV life cycle, and currently the thought is if you could treat HIV, you could prevent AIDS from ever developing. And the way the antiretroviral drugs work is they inhibit the reverse transcription. Again, this affects only the virus and not the host cell, because by the time it's in the host cell, it's been transcribed to DNA. But it doesn't destroy the HIV, but it does delay its progression, and it stops the transmission between mother and child if a woman is pregnant. It blocks the binding of HIV to cell membranes, and it inhibits the assembly of new viral particles in cells. Unfortunately, all these drugs produce side effects from unpleasant to serious, but they do prolong and improve the quality of life for HIV patients. And again, the goal is to put off AIDS fully developing as long as possible. One other positive of AIDS is that even though the virus could get in and take over your body, as far as if somebody has AIDS and they sneeze or touch things on a non-living host, it's very short-lived. It does not have a long life outside the body at all. So that helps it from being a highly contagious virus, such as colds and some other things. Despite having some good treatment options, the drugs are very expensive. They need to be taken together for a long time to be effective. And so this means the people in countries who need the drugs the most are least likely to get them, which is why we have up to a third of the adults in some African countries suffering from HIV and/or AIDS. And developing a vaccine has failed so far mainly because of the highly variable nature of the virus. Again, like other viruses, it mutates often. And the immune system has a very slow response to the presence of HIV. So by the time you're diagnosed as carrying the HIV virus, it may be further along than what we can deal with. There are three main reasons HIV is proving so challenging to defeat. The HIV destroys the T helper cells, which are what we usually use to defend the body against an infection like HIV. It mutates rapidly even within a patient. It said there's more variation in HIV viruses within one patient than there is in influenza worldwide for a whole year. And if you think of the number of people who get flu within the winter, all that variation, there's more of that in one HIV patient, which makes it really hard to target that virus. And it means the immune system must constantly develop a new response to those viruses, and we would have to develop a new drug each time. Also, the virus, like other viruses, often lies dormant in host cells, so the body has nothing to respond to as it's making its way through your body and taking over more and more until all of a sudden the symptoms appear, and then it's a very widespread virus at that point. And that's it for antibacterials and antivirals.